Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning, students. So for today's lesson on Tuesday, 16 September 2021, you will be learning on a new topic of statistics. And today we'll learn a subtopic called types of data. So before we start our lesson, can you please recite our doa sebelum belajar? And please be ready with your pencil paper in case you need to jot down any important notes as we go along our lesson today. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to understand and use vocabulary to describe different types of data: quantitative, qualitative, discrete, and continuous. Now let's compare quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative is something that you can measure and it can be written down with numbers. For example, your age. Let's say you are 13 years old. We can measure that and we can write it down with numbers. Another example would be money. You can count money, right? And you can write it down in numbers. As for qualitative, it is something that cannot be measured. For example, the color of the sky. You cannot measure that. We can only describe it in color form. Let's say the sky is blue. And another example is softness of a cat. So this is something that we cannot measure by number. And this is what we call as qualitative. Now, let's have a look at discrete data versus continuous data. So discrete data is what we called as the ungrouped frequency distribution. Why is it called an ungrouped frequency distribution? Frequency distribution is something that you can represent graphically in the form of, let's say, a bar graph. Okay, when you see a bar graph, it has space in between. So this is what we call as ungrouped frequency distribution. The frequency distribution is the bar graph itself when it's being represented. Ungrouped means the space that it has in between. Okay, so for example, you can represent number of students in bar graph form. You can also represent number of durians on the tree. As for continuous data, it is said to be grouped frequency distribution. So when you want to represent the data for continuous, it can be represented in the form of histogram. When you see a histogram, okay, it does not have space in between, and we align it attached to each other. So this is what we call as the group frequency distribution. And it is measurable and it falls on a continuous sequence. Okay? For example, you can represent mass for continuous data. And you can also represent time, where a race can be timed to a millisecond, but it is not specific to a fixed number, right? So as what I mentioned and explained in the previous slide, so this is the picture form of what I explained just now, where you see we have a bar graph here where there's a space in between here from comedy to action. So comedy is one group and action is another group, and there is a space in between. As for histogram here, we don't have any space from one bar to another bar. And this is why we call this as group frequency distribution. As for bar graph is what we call as the ungrouped frequency distribution. There are four methods to collect data. First is by observation. So when you walk into an environment, you record what you see. For example, you see cars around and you record how many cars are there, and you also see houses at the environment. So you record what is the color of the house for this side and how many houses are there in your environment at that time. And if you see any people, you record how many adults and how many children. And as for measurements, this is another method to collect data, but this is for specifically like weight, height, temperature, or duration. So let's say you are in the classroom with your friends and you want to measure each other's weight and height, and you also want to check the temperature because this is the COVID-19 time, right? So you want to check and make sure that they are in healthy conditions. However, you cannot do it at the current time because you are staying at home and you're not in schools. But remember, before we started our second wave of COVID-19, the teachers early in the morning check your temperatures and making sure you are healthy enough to go to school on that day. So the third one to collect data method is interview. So let's say you want to interview your friends, like asking their biodata, asking their age, what is their favorite food, month of birthdays, favorite shows, and so on. I'm sure you have done this at the early start of this year, maybe in January, when you first see your friends and you want to get to know your friends by asking this stuff and getting to know the other persons better. And lastly, questionnaire. You ask them in written form. So maybe you prepare a paper where you write down their favorite sport, favorite singer, mode of transport to school. Are they using bus? Are they using their own personal cars? So the difference between an interview and questionnaire, interview, you ask them verbally. Kamu macam bertanya saja, bercerita saja. Macam, apa kau suka? Apa kau minat? K-pop? Kau minat K-pop ke tidak? Do you like Blackpink ke? Apakah, you know? But you don't write it in on a paper. But as for questionnaire, you prepare a paper, you write it properly, and you want to keep it safe inside your book. So that is the difference between interview and questionnaire. So before we end our lesson today, there are two things that I want you to do. First, you have to state how many types of data you learned today. List them down. And secondly, there are four methods of collecting data. What are they? Send your answers to my WhatsApp to be graded. I'll see you again next week on Tuesday, 8 a.m. until 9:15 a.m. Please be present. Thank you.